Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and StackState. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead of us, but first, I have to cover a couple of housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch, the on-demand will be made available shortly after we conclude the webinar today. If you have any questions for our speakers, we want you to go ahead and direct those to the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. And for any additional comments, or you just want to let us know from where you're tuning in, I want you to use the chat tab. Finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stick around. So on to our topic today, we'll be discussing driving business performance with observability in financial services. And I'm joined today by Sander Wiefschat, Chapter Lead Testing and Monitoring at Nationale Nederland, Andreas Prins, VP of Product Management at StackState, and Mitch Ashley, Principal of TechStrong Research. And it is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to Mitch. Thank you all so much for being here with me today.
Well, thank you very much, Cody J. Brown. We appreciate that. It's great to be here with my two esteemed colleagues talking about a great topic around observability. And what's fantastic is we get to hear some real world experiences and discuss some of those challenges and solutions, approaches, things that happen. And we always love to share those kinds of experiences with a broad audience. So I do want to say, Sandra is going to be sharing some material with us initially for about 15 minutes or so. Our chat is extremely interactive. So if you have a comment, you have a question, pop something in there. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from today. So please do that in chat now. We'd love to interact with you as we interact together on and off camera. So please pop your messages into chat. Love to hear what you think, questions, etc. So let me start by just asking Andreas if you would just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about you and a little bit about StackState.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mitch. And thanks indeed, Cody, for the introduction. I'm working indeed for StackState, which is a observability company, or actually we're not an observability company. We provide a platform that you can use to do observability, right? And that is important. And I'm leading there the product function. And the cool part of StackState, what I believe is the topology-powered observability capability, which brings all your topology together. And from that starting position on, you can then go for it. And that's where we will talk about much more today, I'm pretty certain. And yeah, we're in all types of technology, but we touch upon that as well a little later.
Excellent. Wonderful. So we're going to turn it over to you, Sandra. I know you can introduce yourself as part of your conversation. Yeah. Andreas and I will go off camera, off mic, and listen as well, engage some on chat while you're talking, and then we'll pop back in when you're finished sharing your material. So turn it over to you. Please introduce yourself.
That's great. I'll introduce myself on the slides, actually. So let's share them immediately. I think they're already available to the participants, but they might be a bit different from what I'm going to show on my screen. There's some extra numbers on my screen. Let me just try and share them. So who am I? I'm Sander Vijfsgracht. I work at Nationale Nederland Bank. I've been working there for, I guess, 8 years now. And I've done quite a lot in that company. Started out as a simple performance tester. But nowadays, I'm a chapter lead testing and monitoring. Actually, I just switched to a new team. And I am now the Scrum Master of the Platform Services team, which hosts monitoring solutions for NN Bank. And in a broader context, also for the entire company, basically. A bit about the company itself. Nationale Nederlanden is a financial services company. We don't just have a bank, we also have insurance. And actually, we started out in insurance. There are over 5 million customers, most of them in the Netherlands, but we also have international customers and business units. And yeah, I think there's over 10,000 employees. So it's really a big company. Yeah, and I'm quite proud to be part of it. What's our current situation? Well, I think this background is the current situation. It's basically a puzzle. A lot of stuff is going wrong. And we see a lot of impact happening. We also see sometimes what is going wrong, so what the cause is if something goes wrong. But putting it all together, that's the real puzzle in operations. We see impact somewhere, we see a bunch of stuff going wrong somewhere else. We don't always see how things are related. That's really the challenge of our job, isn't it? What is going wrong and how to relate it to the root cause. And if any one of you ever had to do a root cause analysis, you know it's not so easy. Management often tells you it should be, and why are you taking such a long time? But it's really difficult to find a proper relation. In our company, when we started our journey towards better observability, we had some bad numbers. And these are numbers from a few years ago. So looking at NN Bank, when we started the journey towards IT, AI ops and observability, and also using StackState, our availability over the entire NN Bank was 97.5%, which for a bank, which should be trustworthy, is extremely low. Specifically, the big banks using payments as well, they strive to 99.8, or in some cases the 4-9 principle, which is 99.99% availability. So you can imagine if your availability is like this, customers are not very happy. And we saw that as well in the complaints and in the user experience. Our NPS was a 6.6 at the time. Our mean time to repair was quite high for prior one incidents. The service level agreement said 2 hours maximum to fix it. In practice, it was 4 to 6 hours on average. And so that also means there were incidents that took days in some cases. So yeah, that's quite bad. And thankfully, our management woke up and the operations woke up, and they realized they had to do a lot better. And we started on a journey. We started on a journey where we could relate our IT to business performance and improve the business performance, but also at the meantime, see where in the IT landscape lies the issue. That is a three-phased approach, and I will briefly go through the 3 phases, and then I will explain them in more detail in a second. The first approach, the first step, is to set up a centralized data lake where you gather all the relevant data you need. And then you create dependencies between the data, so you can have that relation that we were missing. And then finally, what you want to do is move towards predictive monitoring. And that's the real future challenge. That's what we call AI ops. First step at our company, it looks like this. We have Splunk as a centralized solution. And I still think it's an awesome tool. I want to have said that. And that's the central data lake. We had a discussion when we started the monitoring maturity, what we call it, what it should be. And Splunk was around for a long time. It actually started within NN Bank as well. And it had become the centralized data lake. And around that, we had a lot of data sources as well: SolarWinds, Prometheus, AWS CloudWatch, Azure, and a bunch of other monitoring tools not even included on these slides, where the agreement was made centralized. If you have relevant data for incidents or stuff going wrong, please send it to Splunk so everyone can have access to the data. And when something goes wrong, we can all see it. It sounds great, right? So you have one centralized data lake for your issues. And yet it was not great. And you might be a bit surprised here. And again, I want to stress out, Splunk is an awesome solution. It's very suited as a centralized data lake. If you work at NN and you are in this demo session and you work for the Splunk team, your solution is awesome, definitely. But it's not enough. Why is it not enough? Well, here's a example Splunk dashboard that a team used at the time. And you can see that they monitor a lot. And it's all in the greens. And then we can see some availability numbers on the top right, which are not. And already here we see a bit, okay, that's weird. Their availability is not okay, but the underlying data apparently is. So there's something deeper going on. This is the same data in a different view. And here kind of you see the issue arising already. This is a management view. So they're looking at something else. They're looking at the bigger numbers. They're seeing them wrong. They're seeing issues. And this might be, from the technical team, where everything is hosted data, where you can't see anything going wrong. So even when we have a centralized data lake in Splunk, and this is actually an AWS picture, but it doesn't really matter, the principle is the same, we see differences. Not everyone is having the same picture. So someone is having a picture where things are going wrong, and someone else is not seeing something going wrong, but it might be on their end. And getting these people to talk to each other and to find the root cause, that is what cost us a lot of time. Usually somewhere in the data there was the root cause, but the team responsible for that root cause didn't know the business impact, and the business impact knowing teams didn't know the root cause. That was our main issue with Splunk. Even when we had it as a centralized data lake, everyone had still had their own view within it. And that's when this Gartner quote came along. And I put it in the slides because I really like it, and it determines why we moved to stack state. Capturing where events occurred and their up and downstream dependencies using graph and bottleneck analysis can provide great insight on where to focus your remediation efforts. This for us was key. That means that we need dependencies. We need to know if something is going wrong, how it impacts the business, and if the business is impacted, what is going wrong. We tried to do it, of course, with the solution we already had first, and we kind of failed. There is a plugin for Splunk called Splunk ITSI. It can do a lot of powerful stuff, but what we tried to do with it turned out wasn't really possible at the time. We could make a total overview in that tool, but we had to make it by hand, and it was a static picture. That means that if the IT landscape changed, the static picture in Splunk we built would not change with this landscape. So every time I release something, I had to change my Splunk view. And you can imagine that becomes extremely time consuming extremely quickly, which is what we saw in the proof of concept as well. If someone made a change to the application landscape, we had to change the Splunk dashboard as well. And it took a lot of maintenance. And it was still limited to what we had in Splunk. Even though it was a centralized data lake, not all technical data was there. You can imagine that if you have network data, there's a lot of traffic going back and forth on the network, specifically in a big company with over 5 million customers, of which a lot of them log in daily. The amount of network traffic is staggering. And if you put that in your centralized data lake, you would quickly get lost. So we had limitations with Splunk. We tried, we had limitations. So we had a look at different solutions. And we actually came up with stack state AIOps. We also proof of concept of that. Maybe a side note here. What's funny to know is we thought of the concept monitoring maturity, and we did some research into it, and we adopted it. And then we got on this journey, and we contacted Stack State because we thought the tool was awesome. And it turned out the entire monitoring maturity concept was from Stack State as well. So not only is their solution great, their theory is spot on as well. So what does Stack State provide as a benefit over Splunk? Well, it provides auto discovery, and for me that was really a game changer. If your landscape changes, Stack State can catch that, and it will update the topology automatically, and it will update the view automatically, and that's an absolute lifesaver when you're in a CI/CD environment where at any moment in time the landscape can change. It can also detect the changes itself if you hook it up with ServiceNow or CMDB data. And it can show you your full stack, including the network data, which was really for us what helped us move forward. We like to call it, or actually I think someone from Splunk made this quote. They called it the turbo on top of Splunk. And I think that's what Stack State is. We have Splunk as a centralized data lake, extremely powerful. We have these tools around it. And in Stack State, we can bring it all together. How we did that is we built a lot of the reports and KPIs in Splunk because we already have the data there. And we send the metrics to Stack State via the API. And we're doing the same for SolarWinds as we speak. So that's the network data. And we connect all these environments together in Stack State. And there we build one centralized view. And every team can have their own view based upon the centralized view. And so that's kind of different than what we're doing in Splunk. This is an example. It's not a current example, but for this demo, it doesn't really matter. It's not a current example. On the top, you see the business application layer. So we have business application data. We generated ourselves with a different tool, but you can imagine that's also Google Analytics, for instance, you can use there. If you have other tools like Usability, you can enter it here as well. And you have the business layer that includes also process steps that are happening. You could do it from the same data source. You might have services defined. You can monitor those as well. We tried it as a proof of concept. It worked for us. And at the lower layer, you have the IT layer. So that's the application layer, maybe the databases. If you use Amazon Web Services, maybe the EC2 instances, something like that. So there's probably network there. You can enter it there as well. And this picture is already what sold me on the solution, because I don't only have my entire topology here, but at the bottom, I can see an awesome timeline that tells me when something started going wrong. That marker, that's when issues started happening. And you can move back in time in stack state to that point and see what's going wrong then. And you see in this picture, the database is going wrong. We can see it has an effect on the application layer already because metrics there are beginning to shift. And if you go all the way to the top, the business application data is still fine, but we do already know the business application is affected by the database issue. And if you move forward in time, you might see more and more stuff going red. And this is extremely powerful, but because this time traveling helps you get to the root cause extremely quickly. And that's what cost us a lot of time in the past. We had this one snapshot in time when the Prio1 incident was being called. Teams looked at their dashboard, 10 things were in error status, and they couldn't quickly move back to the root cause when the issue started happening. And they didn't have this total picture. And with this, they do have that picture. And on the right, you can also see that if you click on one of the applications or databases, you can see the metrics behind it. And these metrics can be from different data sources. So in our case, they could be from Splunk for the databases, but we might also have a process running on a database that sends a log directly to stack state. And then we have two sources for the same bullet in overview. And that's really strong. We often send application data to Splunk, but the CloudWatch metrics not, for instance. But we can recombine them in stack state. This is really what sold it for me. And we started to try and use this. And we created the dependencies, and then we had a look at the benefits, because it seems awesome, right? But in practice, is it? We had the following benefits. We have a common understanding nowadays of the entire landscape across the teams and tools. That's really the most powerful thing we achieved, is that we got rid of the discussion for teams using stack state of where an issue is occurring and who's responsible, because they have this shared view. Of course, every team has their own view, but under the hood, it's all connected, and you can jump to the root cause quickly, and you can expand the dashboard when an issue is occurring. So if some issue is occurring, we know how it's all connected, and everyone is looking at the same status, and everyone can time travel to when it began and see, okay, it started with this team. We also achieve real-time visibilities into dependencies. So we're no longer dependent on an outdated CMDB when we have an issue. We can open stack state and see, okay, this is the current state of my entire chain. This is what it looks like. These applications have been deployed. Or this deployment at this point in time caused this issue. Because it also supports business data, we can relate IT issues to business performance. If we have the business metrics in place, like for instance, how many people are leaving a page at a certain moment in time, and we see that decreasing, and we also at the same time see latency increasing because of a deployment, then we can relate it together, and in the past we could not. And all that leads to that we can call the right people for the right issue when something is going wrong. But this is not all. This is what we are currently doing and what we have achieved for some teams. Not every team yet, but we're still getting teams on board. But the next step is there as well in the tool already, and that's the predictive monitoring step. Because up until now, everything has been reactive. Something happens, we're waiting for something to happen, and then we act. But we also see the potency of stack state, that it can do predictive monitoring. That's really what you want to do in AI ops. You want to move forward. You want to learn from your mistakes, and you want to try and predict them. And that's challenging if you want to build that. And so also you have to think about, what do I build and what not. Stack state is future-proof in that sense, that it helps you do that. You can train models in stack state. You have the stack state gym. So you can give it a model of when something went wrong. You can put all your data in there, and it will learn for next time. Okay, when finally this issue happened, I saw the latency slowly increasing before that issue. So next time when your latency is slowly increasing, it will give you signals already that something is about to go wrong horribly. Another thing that when you want to do predictive monitoring, you might want to do tracing, but tracing is extremely costly on a server. This is from my performance test background. Performance tracing is awesome, but it also costs performance. So whenever someone wanted to analyze an issue by doing a performance trace, I would always warn them, be very careful about that, because it has impact on your performance. And then the trace might be affecting itself, and you might be seeing the wrong issues in the trace. So think about it. That's the cool thing about Spotlight. It helps you determine where the issues are, and it helps you put tracing on those issues, but not on the rest of your landscape, because doing tracing everywhere would be very expensive. In the end, that leads to actionable insight where you can prevent the issues, and you could maybe hook other tools up to automatically remediate them. I must be honest, this is what we want. This is not what we have right now, but we are investigating it. And I am seeing that with some of the metrics I have, I can already manually predict some of the issues. So I'm very curious if we try and automate this, where it will lead. But yeah, we're not currently there yet, because you need the previous step first for every team. What do we want to achieve? Well, we want to move from that bad situation to a better situation, and we thought about that. For us, currently, that means 99.8% availability. But we are thinking of upping the bar to 99.9. But that will be extremely challenging. We want to reduce the mean time to repair. So if you're in stack state, the goal should be less than an hour. And we want to improve the customer experience. And that's an old number. I didn't ask for the latest number yet. But this is a number from 2 years ago. That's when we were going for then. Icing on the cake, we had this picture earlier. And you can see here on the picture, it says week 19 of 2019, and it's a Dutch notation of the date. So it's the 6th of May. From 6th of May to the 12th of May, and this was a bad week. These were actual production numbers from a rather technical tool. It counted every single minute of outage that week, and it didn't consider service windows, so the numbers are quite bad. And this was then real-time data. We started this journey, and now I picked a snapshot of the same updated dashboard for nowadays. This was last week, and this has now become a typical week. So where in the past a typical week was this, now a typical week is this. You can still see it's not all in the green, but we're seeing a lot more green numbers, and I've even seen teams reach 100% availability over the course of a week, which in the past was unthinkable. So this AI ops journey, if you start it and take it seriously, it definitely helps your availability ratings. And we're getting less complaints from customers about functionality being broken as well. Of course, they still occasionally happen, because you can see we're not there yet. And we know that the NPS score has gone up. I don't have the exact number, but it's a lot better. Some key takeaways if you want to go on an AI ops journey. Yeah, it's a journey, and don't forget that there's no magical silver bullet that if you have this, it will fix everything. It's a long journey, but it's one you have to start today. If you don't, it will only take longer and longer, and you will lag behind. If you go on this journey, automation is key as well. We are automating a lot of stuff. That's what you should strive for. The operations, it should be about analyzing the issues and preventing them for next time. It should not be about, I have to follow a procedure and fill in this form entirely, and I have to do the same remediation efforts 10 times by hand. If you notice that you have to do the same remediation twice, I would already consider automating it. And I think the most important one, this is often forgotten, for us was actually support from management level. These kind of things in big companies, you need a lot of teams together. You need to have support from the product owners. You need centralized teams to help you. If you use AWS, it's probably centralized in your IT organization. They need to implement some things for you. You need standardization in terms of how you log. And to get that all done, of course, the engineers typically know how to find each other, but they need time. And to get time, you need support from management level. And it also helps if they adopt the metrics you provide. If you provide them with the availability numbers and you can explain them, in my experience, they want to get them better. And that's what you saw on the green and the red and the orange pictures earlier. Those are being sent to management, and they want to have everything in the green. That's our story. That's why we're using StackState. If you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A and we'll try and answer them. And I hope I inspired you to go on a similar journey.
Sander, that was fantastic. Appreciate the transparency of you showing real numbers. That doesn't always happen, and it makes it real, right? We've all lived challenges, and to know where you were and where you've come to in that amount of time is pretty phenomenal. So appreciate that very much. Yeah, and as Sander mentioned, jump in on chat if you have a question, you have a comment. I say something crazy you don't agree with, whatever. Jump in, be part of our dialogue here, and we want to include you as we continue on. So cool. So Splunk is not a new tool. I remember coming across Splunk in the mid 2000s or so. A lot of organizations have implemented Splunk. Do you remember kind of what the use case, what the qualifier was for why we're implementing Splunk, and sort of what you were trying to get out of it? Because I think what we're going to hit on is but why StackState on top of that? Why was that beneficial?
Yeah, I still remember that. When I started at our company, we were not doing monitoring at all, or very rudimentary. And that meant if we had an issue, that someone had to print the application logs and they would sift through it by hand, which sounds like a joke, right? You have a major incident and we have to print the logs. And actually some developers preferred it that way. They didn't want a centralized tool where they could quickly view them. They thought it was their job to go through the logs by hand. And that all changed when we did a big migration. So we bought a separate company and we integrated that within the bank systems. And that's actually also how I got my job. That crashed massively. They didn't load test it. It went to production. Everyone logged in because they all got the email or a message at the same time, and it crashed massively. And that's when they realized, one, we do need load testing. That's how I got my job. And two, we need to have a system in place where when this happens, we can quickly remediate it. And they did within the bank a test with Splunk, and they got all the teams onboarded into Splunk. And they put up some basic queries and dashboards, and it took a real flight from there. Once people realized I can do a query like on Google on what's going wrong in my logs, and I get quick results, and it's the issue, that's when you sell it. And also the visualization helped. You saw the metrics I just had on screen. Most of them were from Splunk. It helped our management as well. That's how we started with Splunk. Yeah. And it really took wind the last few years.
I started to break out in a little bit of a cold sweat there, hearing that story, but a little too familiar. And it sounded like it's interesting because, developers, I think, saw their value is interpreting the log and doing that for us. And now, of course, the value they bring is so much, much more. And that's part of why we use tools like that. But, one of the things you point out to is it isn't just aggregating it all together. It's like, how do you make sense of it all across applications, across events, across change, across time? I mean, Andreas, that's where the real kind of meat, the real value of this is, right? Having this data.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It's really about bringing the data together. And let me explain a little bit why that is so important, right? And it was already in Sander's story, but let me kind of summarize that. But what I first want to say, right, and I realized by your presentation, Sander, as an end consumer, right, it's so easy to go online on Twitter, right, when your bank is down or whatever, right, and you just complain on Twitter, right, and you you showed it to the entire world. But if you then realize how much effort it actually takes from all of these developers, right, from all of us to get these applications to the stability we are used to, right, we take it for granted. That's kind of insane, right? It's a journey of years to step by step improve it.
Yeah.
But going back to your question, Mitch. So what I really took out of the story of Sander, right, is the kind of the correlating the data together is the secret sauce, ultimately to start answering a lot of questions. And I must admit, right, the fact that NN had such a great starting position with the data already structured into a central place, right? That's where it starts, right? And that's for a lot of companies still kind of a difficulty where each DevOps team has their own tool and their own monitoring, right? So thinking about how does data come together in a super structured way, that's where it starts. And then the second thing that Sander mentioned somewhere in between the lines is the graph type of thinking, right? So if you think about dependencies between components, and he's shown that in the example, then the graph thinking is super important to understand, right? Your upstream, downstream, your neighbors, actually your entire relationship. And why is that important? Because by only having it stored in correlation with each other, or the topology, you can start enriching that with other data, right? And then you can start traveling throughout the graph. And then it doesn't matter much if you're asking the question all the way from the top, right? Like a management dashboard, or you're asking a question from a specific component in particular, because you actually have the same data, but you observe the cube, if you like, right, from a different angle, and that's how you solve it. And then the last step, which is important to understand, right, dependencies change over time, right? Where in the past we had our CMDB, right, which was super static. If you think about all the data stored in dependency or in context of each other, that's the dynamic nature of the beast, right? And at any moment in time, you need to see that. And in particular with an outage, it can be caused by a component that is no longer visible, or that is no longer part of the entire current state. But then in particular, going back in time and seeing that is super important. So having the data, store it in structure, in a graph, and then being able to travel through it is, I do believe, the secret sauce to embark on the journey Sander just alluded to.
Sander, you appreciate your thoughts on that too. Anything you want to add to that perspective? You've lived this.
Yeah, no, I think Andreas is right there. You know, that's really the most powerful thing of the tool. And when I show it to engineers, they're always a bit reluctant. But, you know, there are a lot of suppliers out there, and they nowadays have the balls to approach engineers directly as well. And especially a big company, we get a lot of demos. And they always show the beautiful world. And then the question comes, how do I implement it, and what do I actually get? And it always kind of disappoints. But when I show them how StackState works, and I show them that the correlation actually functions, and you can quickly drill down to the root cause, that's when their eyes light up like, wow, this saves me so much horrible work, because the work is actually horrible, and it's not horrible in finding the root cause. That we find that fun as engineers, but the horrible work is convincing someone else you found it, and that person never will say it's me. They always say it's someone else, and then you go to that someone else, and they direct you to someone else, and you get the runaround within the company, specifically in the big companies. And we know in the tool, that's no longer possible. And once people realize that, and they also realize, okay, I can quickly see that, and we all feel responsible. And it's the same picture, the same data. There's no argument possible about that. That's when you can start solving the issue.
Yeah. And the other thing that was triggered in my mind, Sander, when you started answering, right, from a team perspective, it is pretty valid, right, to look at the responsibility zone that you're responsible for, an app, a database, a combination of a couple of microservices. But if you think about a company, right, having a customer responsibility, that's never a single component, right? It's never an app and a database, right? And these days in particular, right, it gets crazy. If you think about internet banking or your insurance app or whatever, right, it's a complex that's crossing 10 DevOps teams, right, with potentially hundreds of components. So yeah, don't blame the team, right? But if you think about the company and then the customer, you need that end-to-end structure one way or the other to
yeah, and if you provide that to the team with a tool like this, like, okay, you still have your own compartmentalized small picture, but it's tied to the bigger picture
Exactly.
underneath. And when there is an issue somewhere in that landscape happening that's hitting you, you can see it, and you can then get the bigger picture and see where the cause lies. That makes teams happy, and also it makes the business people happy because they know, oh, my issue has been spotted and it's already being worked on by the correct people.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about is sort of that context. It's not just correlation, having the data on one place.
No.
It's like the meaning of it. and
It's
context
part of
of
the journey as well. You would start with the smaller picture. That makes perfect sense. Within our company, we have the monitoring maturity model we've adopted from StackState, and we have 4 levels. I think nowadays you guys are at the 5th level, but we're still on 4. And we always, to our starting team, we tell them the first 2 levels are very important to have right from the start. And that's that you have an idea of your own scope and the scope of your direct neighbors. And your own scope should be white box monitoring, so you should know fully what's going on there and which metrics are important. And the neighboring scope should be black box monitoring. So ask the team in front of you and after you to deliver a piece where it's a single metric that tells you whether they're functioning yes or no. And once you have that and want to move forward, then it's level 3 monitoring and you need the entire picture. But first do the first 2, otherwise you're going to have a bad time with the third one. And that's the journey we're on, and we're convincing people to join. And when I show them, when they already have that level 1 and 2, they know these problems, right? They know how difficult it can be to convince someone else. If you then show them something like this, their eyes light up. Like, wow, this is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't have experience with the problems in the past, it's a bit more difficult.
Well, yeah, then you can very easily relate if you do, right?
Yeah.
Well, to that point, so there's this idea of time to value from whenever you're looking at a new technology or a tool or approach. It's the idea of how long does it take from, you start working on solving it a different way, using an additional tool or whatever it might be, to, okay, this is making a meaningful difference. You didn't get to changing your NPS score, from where it was to where it is now in one step, right? It was a journey you mentioned. What was there kind of not a eureka moment, but a sort of like, okay, we're on the right path here as you were heading down the path with StackState?
No, for StackState, that was actually pretty quick. We've done it with a few tools now, right? So we've done it with Splunk. You saw the availability numbers in there. That's a custom built tool. We call it JMonitor. We did that same thing there, and we did for StackState. I think for Splunk, to get it to the centralized data lake state, that was 5 years probably. The potential was within bank pretty clear right from the start. But the adoption, we needed to get a lot of teams in there, and it took years. For the availability numbers, we took 3 months to build it ourselves, and we compared it to an old tool we had, and that comparison, that sold it within the next month. So that was 4 months. I think for StackState, once we had it up and running and compared it to Splunk ITSI, I think it was 2 months, something like that. And the comparison we made, I was immediately sold. I saw only benefits basically. And that's because we already, of course, had a lot in place. We had the centralized data lake, we had the data structures. That's definitely a requirement to get starting quickly. But also, I would stress that if you don't have that yet, you can still start a journey. Because starting this journey forces you to think about that, and you will discover that your data is not okay, that your metrics are not okay. You will discover your points where things are going wrong, and that's all part of it, and it's natural, and you want to discover that, you want to see that. When I come with a new tool somewhere in the company, I always encounter new issues for that team, because for automation, you need to have things in place, you need to have standards in place, and the teams often think they do, and they do think their data quality is okay. But then it turns out, today example, we had a stupid one. They were using an ampersand somewhere, and the technical tool couldn't handle it. And my coworker said, well, I need to code exceptions for this. And I said, no, you don't need to. They're doing it wrong at the data end. Go back to them and have them fix the data. And the team was very receptive. Oh, we never thought about this, and they changed it. So that's what you will discover with tools like this. But to answer your question, yeah, in stack state, I think it was 2 months for us when already the value was clear. And it helped that we had a lot of other monitoring in place.
Pretty good. You were able to compare what you were doing to what the difference was. Yeah. Go ahead, Andres. You were going to say something.
No, I mean, that's fair to say, right? There was already an entire practice from a kind of the low level, or not the low level, right? Just from the component monitoring. Then there was already the understanding, right, of pushing the data into a central data lake, right? And then what you mentioned in your story, right, was the booster on top of, right? And then it's 2 months, right? But we see with other customers who are starting new, right, who are pushing data into it, whatever, tracing data, metrics, logs, right? It can take a little longer because you start then most of the time really small at a couple components rather than at the full-blown graph, right, as that was already present in Nationale Nederland. So that's important to understand. However, that doesn't mean, right, if you have a small chart or a small graph, right, with, for example, what you alluded to, the propagated health, right, the component fails, how does that impact all the way to the top of my business application? That's something probably not at the full size of your entire company, but at least, right, at the single user flow or user journey where you can start with, right? But yeah, having the data structured is important. And then there's another important part of having the topology already in place, and that's then the next level, right? Because you mentioned AI, and imagine if you have just unstructured data, how much more difficult it is to start applying AI versus the data is already correlated to each other, right? So also towards the fourth level, growing to AI, you need to grow to the earlier 2 or 3 stages because the data is structured, and that helps you tremendously to much faster detect patterns or come up with predictions as such.
Interesting. Yeah, the best place to start is one step forward from where you are, right? You don't have to be all the way down the path to take that last step to get worse on.
Yeah, and I would also like to note that we didn't have the full topology in our first version of StackState. And we still saw the value because we then realized we did not have the full topology. And if we never implemented that tool, we would not have known that. I put that down as one of the advantages when I went to management. Like, okay, in StackState, we can see that we're missing things. We see business metrics going off, and we're seeing that we're not seeing it in the technical data. We're missing something here.
There's a gap. Yeah.
So it's really, really good, because I wanted to ask about this, and our audience also asked this question about getting management buy-in. You talked about management support. How do you gain that? How do you speak in business terms, that whether it's to your IT management or to the business?
It might be good to know that I do have a master's degree in business administration and IT. So I was trained to be an IT manager, and I ended up an engineer. But that means I understand our language at least. And that's one of the things to realize when you're an engineer, that management might speak a slightly different language, and you might want to get accustomed to it. Even if you don't like them using the buzzwords, try and get an understanding of what they mean and how they translate to the work you're doing, because that will help you sell your solution. And forget about the details. They're not interested in the details. They want aggregates, and they want comparisons. And give them options. That's also one of the things I've learned. So I always approach new tools. I'm quite straightforward. That maybe it's a typical Dutch thing, but I don't really care about the organizational structure. I see potential in the tool, and I get some people around me, and I will try and get it working, despite of what other people might think. And I will always try to make, and I think it's in a DevOps world, it's called a zero version. A version, a proof of concept, where you can show the value, even if the end product state is not achieved yet. If you wouldn't release it to your customers, but you can still show the value. That's what I try and build. If possible, I will compare it to a different tool and do the same thing there. So that for StackState, we did it with Splunk ITSI at the same time. And then I went to management with the results of both. And I thought of some metrics that are relevant, which were not only what both tools could do, that's positives and benefits of each tools, but also how long does it take to implement the solution? How much maintenance will it take? Is it performing okay or not? I'm a tester from the background, so I always take the ISO 25010 norm That is basically quality attributes of a solution. And I rate every tool on those things. And I also think what's important for this tool to have. And I communicate that to our management, like, okay, this is how it scores. This is a lot of work, this is not. And then I give them options. I say, okay, this is each tool, this is what the tool costs. That's always what they want to know. So always include that and be honest about it. Don't lie, be honest about it. And I always also give the option, do nothing. Because that sometimes is the most valid option at the time. And even if it's not the most valid option and you want to get your tool adopted, tell them they can do nothing and tell them they will reach nothing, because then they are more inclined to go with your solution.
Sander, a couple of thoughts on that just to share from my own experience. One is, if you don't have a business administration degree, go find a business person to kind of mentor you. Go take your case to them and have them help you put it in business terms. You don't have to be a business expert, right? But you can kind of shed the technical things that are going to make other people feel dumb and put it into business language they're going to relate to, or maybe what's important to the organization. I think the other is tie it to the metrics. Tie it to customer experience. How long does it take for us to recover when there's a failure? Things are going to matter, to the business. So, spot on with that. Andres, do you have any other suggestions like that?
No, I actually don't have. I do think the majority is called out here. I was about to say, right, think about the customer, right? That's their purpose, right? So that is super important. And from an IT perspective, I tend to forget it, right, from day to day. But that is super important. And leave
it might be good to note in that light that the metrics you saw, the availability numbers, we measure them from the customer perspective. A lot of IT teams try and measure them from their API or their application, but that's not what it's about. It's about, can the end user reach my application, yes or no? And if he can't reach the application because, let's say, your content delivery network is out and all your stuff is doing okay, if you would measure it on your stuff, you would never spot it, but the customer would still be unhappy. So we build a custom monitoring solution that just does that. And I was able to use that to sell StackState because I could say, okay, we see that when our customer availability takes a hit, then we can relate the root cause in StackState.
One of the issues or questions our audience, folks that are with us today, is asking about, when you move from kind of beyond the log aggregation, correlation, alarms, alerting, and moving to an AI ops model, a StackState kind of approach, was there more information, more data that you needed that you weren't collecting? You mentioned you kind of discovered you maybe had some of the wrong data. I wasn't quite remember how you stated it, but what did you learn that you found might be helpful to even get more value to get into that place where AI ops is kind of making it happen?
That's a good question. I think what we learned, and we're still working on getting that data in StackState, we have a lot of the application data there. That's because that's already in the centralized data lake. The first thing we noticed that we were missing CloudWatch metrics. So a lot of our stack is on AWS hosted. They have excellent monitoring views themselves, and teams didn't bother to put the data into Splunk. That's why it was in the presentation as well, that CloudWatch metrics. There are teams that don't have it in Splunk. That's the first thing we realized, like, okay, we do have everything in the CMDB and we do have the application logs, but we're missing CloudWatch metrics. So we built stack packs on the CloudWatch machines or on the Amazon machines. And now that entire topology part is being automatically forwarded and generated. And then the next thing we noticed, now we have the entire application and also the hosting level of it, but we're not seeing the network data. And we did see that because we didn't have that, the network teams got blamed when issues happened. So we got in touch with them, like, okay, we know you have an awesome solution called SolarWinds for that. We know there's a lot of data there. And they were doing kind of the same stuff. And they were getting fed up with all the complaints about the network, even when it's not the network. Some of you guys in the chat might recognize this from your own company. It's always the network when an issue is going wrong. And if you're working on a network end, then they often didn't see, like, okay, but my metrics are okay. They're green. And then I come along and say, yeah, because nobody can reach your application anymore. That's why your metric is green. You're not measuring the right thing. That's the gap, the latest gap we saw. And we're tackling that by putting all the network data in stack state as well. And probably once we have that fixed, we'll see the next gap.
Yeah, so one of the things where you're referring to, Sander, is really right understanding my end-to-end picture and what are the gaps, right? And you mentioned that already twice now, right? So you need to fill these blanks. And why is that important, right? If you think about AI or if you think about using the machine to help you out. In the past, right, when there was an outage, we would be called together in the war room, right? And we would have used our tribal knowledge, and often, right, the most expensive people that are working the longest for the company would go in there, right? Because they know all the ins and outs and they know how components are wired together. But now imagine, right, that you only have only one expert of a single domain, right? How would you then apply the AI, which is a kind of the tribal knowledge that is in everyone's mind? And I do believe by building that topology and filling the gaps, you're actually kind of collecting in a dynamic way based on data, how stuff is structured and how stuff behaves, right? Because you're attaching metrics, traces, logs into that, right? And that is super important because normally you would do that by with your brain, and now the tool needs to do that, but then you need to tell the tool how it's connected. That's one. And the second thing which is important is there's metrics, traces, logs, right? Which says something about the component, but what about the change, right? So keeping track of the changes that are occurring, right? Newer versions, what did happen, what was exactly deployed. That is also super important because that often tells you, right, why stuff is failing, or right, the change is the moment in time a line start going down or start going up. So keeping change into account is another important one in my opinion.
Now that you say that, that's our next gap. I just realized that. We haven't put in the ServiceNow data into stack state yet. We do have it in Splunk, and we correlate it occasionally. And I think that's 50% of our outages is changes going wrong.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Andreas, as you've worked across customers and helped them implement the technology, are there any lessons learned, kind of maybe typical stumbling blocks folks might encounter that you can sort of guide them past easily? What are maybe some of the steps that, if you do a couple of things, this will help your journey go a little smoother?
Yeah, one is knowledge, right? This space is moving so so super fast, right? So how do you keep up? And we're still focusing on implementing monitoring, and then there's open telemetry around the corner. And if you've implemented open telemetry, then all of a sudden there are no components because we go to serverless. So how do you keep up not only with the observability or monitoring space, but everything that is impacting? I do see a lot of companies or people or teams actually struggling there, right? So some useful coaching, right? A little SRE team coaching 10 DevOps teams, that could be super helpful to actually solve that gap. Another one, right, is the tool sprawl, right? With the love of DevOps and autonomous teams, right? All teams start using their own tools that are nicely fitting with their technology. But how do you keep track of the bigger picture? And then a Splunk type of move is a super powerful one, because then you bring the data back together, right? And that's needed, as we've learned, to go on top of. And the other really important thing, I believe, where companies struggle with is, or teams in particular, there is simply so much data available, right? So you just start monitoring without asking yourself the question, what is the purpose, right? Why do I want to observe this component? And what is the intent of the component? What's going up? What's going down? What are my neighbors? What is the business function of this entire chain, right? And I do think that's another one. Just go back to the whiteboard, right? And have a brainstorm. What is it that we want to achieve? And what is it that then the data that helps us? Because otherwise teams go into Kibana, right? And starting to create the most advanced dashboards and put them on the wall, right? Yeah, if they don't have the right thresholds, the customer is still impacted. So thinking about that, using some expertise from outside might be super, super helpful as well.
It's a great place.
I can agree with that, Andreas. It's actually a challenge for a lot of our teams, and I challenge them on it. From my centralized role, I look at some of their dashboards, and it's total information overload. And I'm like, okay, I'm a monitoring expert. I'm not even making sense of your dashboard right now. And I try and coach them on it. Like, okay, do you really need all this information when you first open the dash? Or is just one green sphere good enough that tells you it's okay? And when it's not okay, then maybe show the details.
Exactly.
And that's stuff I coach them on.
Yeah.
And that's an eye-opener for most teams. Like, only when it's going wrong, I need the details. I don't need to know that it's going okay everywhere. And it actually blows up most monitoring solutions when teams start to build like that, because then the performance takes a massive hit if you try and monitor everything. I also thought it was good that you just said about how do I keep my skills up. Doing this process correctly and moving towards AI ops, it will free up your people. And that might sound weird because automation is an investment, right? But you have to earn it back. And how do you earn it back when those really expensive specialists within your company are only contacted when they are needed to be contacted? And the war room is a perfect example of things that worked in the past that you might still want to do today, but you want to be smart about it. You don't want to call all your specialists into a war room and have all of them sit there for 3 hours trying to find the issue together. And it turns out it's an issue that you need just one specialist for. If your tool can tell you that, you can just call that one specialist and save 3 hours of time from all the other ones they could then spend on skill improvement.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not about the quantity of metrics. It's about measuring the few right things that matter, right? Simple. Keep it simple, or less is more. A couple of expressions. Well, it's been fantastic. We have a few minutes left. Any parting thought, Andreas, that you want to share with folks before we turn it over to Cody J. Brown to get our gift certificates?
Yeah, the other one that's going through my mind, right, is if you think about feedback cycles, right? I do think feedback, right, you get from observability and monitoring tools. But now if we talk about DevOps, right, observability is no longer at the end of the spectrum, but it's moving more and more towards the DevOps teams, right? So also from a development perspective, think about the feedback you want to get and how can you instrument while you're developing your application, right? How can you instrument your code so you get the right feedback loops from your observability and monitoring tools? We haven't talked about that, right? But that's where it actually starts, right? At the moment you start developing, think about the feedback you want to get from that observability platform that is out there. And that's probably a last one I would like to get here.
I'm glad you said that. I call it the let's DevOps it, right?
Exactly.
It's an iterative process using feedback and continuous improvement. Couldn't agree more. Well, Sander, thank you. Just fantastic. I appreciate it so much. I know I said this before, but being transparent and sharing with us so much about your journey and the experience and the things you've learned and what you brought to the table as well. And Andreas sharing, of course, with us your knowledge of the industry and the space and all the customers that you've worked with. Most important, our audience has been fantastic. All the comments and questions. I didn't always call out who asked what question, but most of those questions came from our audience. So you really made this webinar what it is, this content. So thank you for guiding and directing us. So I'm going to turn it over to Cody, and we can announce our gift card winners and wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Mitch, Andreas, and Sander. Quickly, a reminder that today's session was recorded, so if you missed any of our discussion, maybe you joined late, or you'd just like to rewatch it, the recording will be made available shortly after we conclude, and you can also find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. We also have 4 winners of $25 Amazon gift cards, and they are Hans K., Charles W., Gideon V., and Pauline A. So congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't see that email, just check your spam folder. I'd like to extend our gratitude to Stack State for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience. We really appreciate you being here with us today. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Enjoy.